So I want to start by just saying a heartfelt thank you to a couple of leaders in your midst. First, to your conference president, Andrew. I don't know, Andrew, if you're here. And also to Gavin, who's been toting us around. He drove me up in the mountains today and showed me this beautiful countryside. Andrew and Gavin, if you are here, I have a very small token of my appreciation that I want to give to you tonight. If they're not here, we'll put them in. It's not a big deal. It's just a copy of my latest book. Apparently, they're not selling real well, so we now start just giving them away. This is actually the most recent book that I wrote with my youngest daughter, Claire, entitled, "Are You More Spiritual Than a Fifth Grader?" At the time that we wrote it, she was in fifth grade. Well, then, when the book came out, it was a repackaging of Maury Venden sermons. So if you like Maury Venden, that's what that book is about. But when it came out, she just went ballistic over the fact that they put her picture on the cover. And of course, she was in fifth grade at the time, and when the book came out, she was by now in seventh grade. And so she demanded, "Dad, get that picture off the cover." And I said, "Sweetheart, I have nothing to do with the cover design at all. That's the publishers. They did all of that. We'll tell them to reprint the book." And I said, "Well, it really doesn't work. I'm sorry. No, Dad, I don't want my picture on the..." And finally, the only thing that salvaged the situation was when Big Sister chimed into the conversation. She said, Claire, relax. You just got to remember, this is a book by Dad. It's not like anybody really buys the book and will see your picture. So just calm down." And that seemed to settle her little seventh grade spirits. So wherever they are, thank you for your hospitality. It's just such a blessing to be here. And today I've actually been awake all day, so that's good. It's a beautiful place. Well, growing up, one of my heroes was my dad's second cousin, Eugene Winters. He taught in the physical education department at Walla Walla University for many, many years. Every summer, our family would pile into an unair-conditioned station wagon, 4 kids, drive all the way across the country to go visit Eugene. And I loved being with Eugene because he was just, in my mind, larger than life. An avid scuba diver, rock hound, scratch golfer. He lived this fantasy adventure in life that, in my thinking, was just so cool. I wanted to be just like Eugene. Well, Eugene walked with a very pronounced limp. I discovered as a kid, if I put a pebble in my right shoe, I could walk just like Eugene. And I remember returning home one summer from vacation. My teachers and my classmates all wanted to know, what happened to your foot? I, of course, just parroted the answer that I heard Eugene give many, many times. And so I just explained, the foot, it's a scuba diving accident in the Great Barrier Reef. Of course, I had never been to the Great Barrier Reef, and I had never been scuba diving, but I walked just like Eugene. Well, here a couple of years ago, I had the honor of officiating at Eugene's funeral. And for my text for the homily, I selected 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 1, where the Apostle Paul makes this very bold and audacious statement. He says, "Imitate me as I imitate Christ." I so tried to imitate Eugene as he imitated Christ. The word translated imitate there is actually the word mimeomai, from which we get the English word mimeograph. Any of you remember mimeograph machines? Okay, which is a politically correct way of asking, how many of you are really old? I do remember mimeograph machines. Of course, copy technology has come a long ways by now. But back in the day, the way that you would make copy copies is by these mimeograph machines. Now, they weren't perfect copies, not by a long shot. They were bright blue, remember that? And they had a very strong odor to them, and very blotchy, not a perfect copy, but you nonetheless could tell what the master copy was originally like. Well, Paul says, we're mimeographs, if you will, of the master, not perfect replication of our master, but the idea is to be imitations, to be mimeographs of him. So, you copy me as I copy Christ. It strikes me that that's really the whole purpose behind this gathering this week, is it not? If you were to ask me, what do you hope will be the outcome of the big camp this year in South Australia? I would say, well, I would hope that we would emerge from this beautiful place totally surrendered disciples of Christ, so that we could say with authenticity to the world, look, you just imitate me as I imitate Christ. And the way that I will imitate Christ is as a totally sold out, surrendered disciple of his. But what would that really look like? Understand, this is a radical calling. If we were to take seriously this calling to be sold out, totally surrendered disciples. And I wonder out loud with you this evening, if we actually did this, we left this camp with this commitment, and we actually pulled it off, I wonder if maybe the church would see the same explosive, exponential growth today as it did back then. The early Christian church grew like no other organization before or since. The growth was pronounced, explosive, and exponential. Why do you suppose that was? Consider this. By AD 40, historians estimate that only 1/1000th of 1% of the Roman population claimed to be followers of Christ. Think about how infinitesimally small that number is. 1/1000th of 1%. Fast forward the clock, just 300 years is all. By about 350 AD, historians tell us that in the Roman Empire, 56% of the people claimed to be Christian. The church exploded in growth from 1/1000th of 1% to a relatively short time later, 56% of the Roman Empire were Christian. How could that be? Well, the church was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Very countercultural, very radical. In fact, they grappled with what even to call this organization. There had never been anything like this before. And so, reaching for a descriptor, they found the word ecclesia, the church. That is just the gathering, unlike any other gathering of people before. No wonder in Acts chapter 2 we get this description of the church, that they enjoyed the favor of all people. I love the Message paraphrase of that verse where Eugene Peterson renders it to say, people in general liked what they saw. Every day their number grew as God added to those who were saved. When people looked at the church in the first century, they liked what they saw. Is that the same way it is today? I'm not so sure. Saw a survey recently where people were asked, what are the groups that you fear the most? Number 1 on the list, serial killers. Makes sense. Number 2, pedophiles. Okay? Number 3, Christians. We made the top 3. people most feared. Contrast that now to the early Christian church, where people liked what they saw. They enjoyed the favor of all people. What's the difference? And how is it that they grew as they grew? I just wonder if maybe it was because people just sold out. The church was unlike anything they had ever seen. And so they just completely surrendered their lives to building this radical new kingdom that Jesus came to establish. This kingdom life with God. So I wonder, is it possible to replicate today what we read about back then? To be the same kind of church? Now, to understand this, we're going to have to slog through a little bit of history tonight. Is that all right with you? Anybody like history? Okay. Are you up for a long, boring history lecture? This is the only talk that I have prepared, so whether you like it or not, here we go as we look about what would it be like if we were to treat people the same way that Jesus treated people. Wondering if maybe we would see the same results in a growing church, winning the favor of all people today, if we were to treat people the same way that Jesus treated people. Now, it's important to understand, in the first century, there was a very, very rigid structure relative to social classes. Everybody knew where everybody else was in the social ladder. And it was virtually impossible to improve your lot in life. So at the very top, you had the Roman Senate. And then just under them, you had the equestrian class. Under the equestrians, you had the decurion class. Under that class, you had citizens. Remember, Paul said that he was of the citizen class. At the very, very bottom, of course, you had the slaves, who had virtually no rights or status in society. And everything reinforced where you were at in the social structure. So the clothes that you would wear immediately identified where you were at. You wore certain colors on your toga if you were part of the decurion class, and a different color if you were part of the equestrian class, and so on. Every meal, you sat according to where you were at on this social ladder. And again, it was virtually impossible to change what class you happened to be born in. Very, very rigid structure. Into this world comes this radical rabbi teaching something people had never really thought about or heard about before. This radical teaching where he says, for example, Matthew chapter 20, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wants to be first must be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom to many. So you can just imagine how different this was to be a part of a community where there was no social structure at all. Slaves were the same as decurions. So you can picture the joy of the slave as he is getting his feet washed by somebody, say, of the equestrian class. Where else would you see this but in the church? And I can just picture the slave crying just because he's never been treated as an equal before. And tears from the equestrian as well. Because it's just the sheer joy of living like Jesus taught. The sheer joy of just serving selflessly and what that feels like. Is it any wonder that people from all classes flooded into the church? They wanted to be a part of this radical, countercultural community of Jesus. Think about the way Jesus treated women. Now, again, in the ancient world, it was a harsh reality if you were born a woman. One historian writes, exposure of unwanted female infants, the practice of abandoning them outside, was legal, morally accepted, widely practiced by all social classes in the Greco-Roman world. A little baby girl was born, just a common practice. Chuck her in the trash can. This letter was written by a Roman husband. Apparently his wife was pregnant, and he gave her these instructions. A first-century letter. He says, "Know that I am still in Alexandria. If you are delivered of a child before I come home, if it is a boy, keep it. If it is a girl, discard it." Jewish rabbis every day would pray this prayer at the temple. "Blessed art thou, O Lord, for thou hast not made me a woman." This is their regular prayer that they would pray. The historian Walter Wink says that Jesus violated the politically correct customs of his day in every single encounter that he ever had with women. And you go through every encounter Jesus had with women in Scripture, and it's true. For example, you remember the story of the Samaritan woman in John chapter 4. When the disciples returned, they asked him, "Jesus, why are you talking to her?" Rabbis didn't talk to women, let alone Samaritan women. Or the story in Matthew chapter 8. When Jesus came into Peter's house, he saw Peter's mother-in-law lying in the bed with a fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left her. You wouldn't touch a woman in that culture, let alone a sick woman. And yet, this is what Jesus did. Or the picture that we have in Luke chapter 10, describing Martha's sister Mary. It says, she sat at the Lord's feet listening to what he said. Now, we skim over that, but really what he's telling us here in the text is that she was one of his disciples, part of his inner circle. To say that she sat at his feet is not a statement of geographic proximity, not describing where she was relative to where Jesus was sitting. This is the same description that we get, for example, of Paul, Acts 22, verse 3, where it says, brought up in Jerusalem at the feet of Gamaliel. In other words, he was a disciple of Gamaliel. Jesus included women in his inner circle. And let me just say, as a father of two beautiful young girls, I am so grateful for Jesus' heart for women. I long for the day that the way Jesus honored, ennobled, empowered, and embraced women is as prized in his church today as it was in his life. And Jesus included women. He included people from all classes. Think about the way that Jesus treated children. O.M. Baki, the historian, writes that the ancient world had no clear conception of childhood as we do today. Therefore, violence, leaving a child to die of exposure, if it wasn't wanted because of its gender or poverty or any reason, if it was sickly or something, common practice to leave it to die of exposure. Historians tell us that 50% of children in the ancient world died before the age of 10. 50% of children. So it's in this kind of a world, this teacher comes along and he says things like, let the little children come to me and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as they. Is it any wonder the church exploded in growth because of the way Jesus treated slaves and women and children. A story from Mary Ann Bird. She says, I grew up knowing that I was different, and I hated it. I was born with a cleft palate. When I started school, my classmates made it clear how I looked to others. Little girl, misshapen lip, crooked nose, lopsided teeth, garbled speech. When schoolmates asked, what happened to your lip? I'd tell them I fell and cut it on a piece of glass. Somehow it seemed more acceptable to have suffered an accident than to have been born different. I was convinced nobody outside my family could ever love me. Then there was a teacher in second grade, Mrs. Leonard. Annually, we had a hearing test. Mrs. Leonard gave the test to everybody in the class. Finally, it was my turn. I knew from past years, as we stood against the door and covered one ear, the teacher sitting at the desk would whisper something, and we'd have to repeat it back, something like, the sky is blue, or do you have new shoes? I waited there for her words. God must have put the words in her mouth. 7 words that changed my life. Mrs. Leonard said in a whisper, I wish you were my girl. I wish you were my little girl. That's the message Jesus gave to children. I wish you were my child. Think about the way Jesus treated the sick. Historians tell us that there were 2 epidemics, one dating back to about 65 AD, the other 251 AD, that wiped out roughly a third of the population. Coming into your country, they have new protocols in place now where you have to fill out a special form stating that you have not been in Africa over the past 21 days or whatever it is, because, of course, they're rightfully so trying to protect citizens here of Ebola. And think about how we have responded internationally to stopping the spread of this terrible disease. Now think about some epidemic wiping out nearly a third of the world's population. So it's understandable, according to Dionysius, how they treated the sick. They pushed sufferers away and fled from their dearest, throwing them into the roads before they were dead, leaving the unburied corpses in the dirt, just hoping to avert disease. Or sick people, they just toss you in the ditch and leave you there to die because they did not want the disease to spread. Now, into this kind of a world comes this rabbi who reaches out and actually touches the sick. Matthew chapter 8, a man with leprosy came, knelt before Jesus and said, Lord, if you are willing, you can make me clean. And Jesus reached out his hand and touched the man. I am willing, he said. Be clean. Immediately he was cured of his leprosy. Imagine this story from the leper's perspective. For 5 years, nobody has touched me. Things you take for granted, pat on the back, a handshake, kiss on the cheek, I haven't felt for 5 years. It began at the beginning of the season. As I was out planting seeds, I noticed a numbness in the tips of my fingers. I hoped that it would just go away, but I knew better. As the season wore on, so did this disease. By harvest time, I could hardly feel anything in my arm. Complete numbness. I tried to hide it from people, but how could I really? I walked around cradling that hand as if I were holding a wounded bird against my chest. Washing up for supper one evening, I looked into the basin of water, noticed that it was bright red. Examining my finger, I noticed a deep gash in my finger. I couldn't even tell you how it got there. Just then I heard the voice of my wife behind me. You have some on your robe, she said. Looking down, sure enough, ugly splotches of blood polka-dotted my clothes. Then she asked me, "Do you want me to go with you to the priest?" No, I said, "I'll go by myself." Just then, our 4-year-old daughter joined us. I got on my knees so I could look her directly into the eye and try to explain best you can to a 4-year-old. "Sweetheart," I said, "Daddy is very, very sick, and so I must go away for a long time, maybe forever. But I want you to know, sweetheart, it's not because I don't love you. I love you more than I can even say, but I have no choice. Daddy's very sick, and I must go." With that, I gave her a kiss goodbye. I hugged my wife. And that's the last human touch I have felt for 5 years. Until today. I was hiding behind this big rock. Masses of people walked past me until I saw the healer off in the distance. I jumped out from my hiding place and shouted, "Jesus, Jesus!" Fear flooded through the crowd. Parents went diving after the eyes of their kids, screaming, "Unclean! Unclean!" ripping their kids away from me. Of course, I was used to that kind of response. But then the strangest thing happened. The healer, he actually started walking toward me. Can you imagine? He walked toward me. I threw myself at his sandaled feet and begged, "Jesus, Jesus, if you are willing, you can make me clean." And that's when Jesus broke the law. He reached out, he touched me. You can't touch a leper, but he did. Then he spoke, his voice as gentle as his touch. "I am willing," he said. Then he commanded, "Be clean." Power surged through my back. No longer was I staring at his feet, but now looking him full in the face, his eyes moist with joy. He flashed a 500-watt smile. Now, if Jesus had just wanted to heal me, he could have spoke the word, snapped his finger. He didn't want to just heal me. Instead, before he even healed me, he touched me. Imagine me, unworthy of human touch, and now suddenly deserving of the touch of God himself. Oh, the power of a godly touch, Max Lucado writes. Then he asks, can't we do the same? Of course we can. I wonder if we were to be imitators of the Master, if we were to treat people like Jesus treated people, to see them as valued children of God, I wonder if the church would not explode in growth in the same way today as it did back then. If all of us were to leave Big Camp this year committed to being totally surrendered disciples of Jesus, to treat people just like Jesus treated them. And really, when you boil it down, it just comes down to treating people in every mundane moment of life. It's not necessarily the big healing moments, but just the average, ordinary moments of each day. And so we can begin tonight. I love the old story of Ralph, who made a living later in life just going from university campus to campus giving lectures. Well, he was picked up at the airport by a professor who noticed that Ralph got very easily distracted. Any opportunity that he had to sort of help people, he would just do it. Just from his gate over to baggage claim, he stopped 3 times to help different people. One point, a woman spilled the contents of her luggage all over the floor, and so Ralph stopped and just helped her pick some of the things up. Then a celebrity was making her way through the airport. A little boy wanted a better view, and so Ralph just instinctively grabbed the kid, threw him on his shoulders so that the kid could see the celebrity making her way through the airport. And then as they're waiting for their bags, the professor noticed that a couple came to Ralph asking for directions. They were on a honeymoon, and of course, again, he was happy to oblige. And so the professor said to him, "Ralph, I've noticed that you really take every opportunity you get to help and serve people, don't you?" And he said, "Yeah, I guess I do. I'll tell you why. It's because I did a tour of duty in Vietnam. It was my job to walk through fields, combing them for explosive devices, for landmines." And he said, "I saw almost all of my friends, my closest friends, get blown up by hidden landmines. So I guess I developed this keen sense that every moment could be my last. So I've just decided that I have to live in between steps." And that's the phrase I love. You know, it happens just in between steps. Not just when we're in the church or at big camp or whatever. It's just in between steps. We have opportunities to see people, to touch people, to love people, to serve people, like Jesus did, in between steps. I'll leave you with a story by Kent Nearburn, who is a writer, but he used to be a taxi cab driver in Minnesota, over in the States. He tells about one evening getting a call late at night, about 2:30 in the morning. Went to the seedy part of town. He wasn't so sure of this, but even though many of his colleagues in the taxi cab industry would just take a look and it would smell of danger, and so they would drive on, but he didn't want to do that. He wanted to at least see if there was somebody in need, and so he went up and he knocked on the door, wondering if maybe he was in danger. But then he writes, "As I walked to the door and knocked, 'Just a minute,' answered a frail, elderly voice. I could hear something being dragged across the floor. After a long pause, the door opened. A small woman in her 80s stood before me. She was wearing a print dress and a pillbox hat with a veil pinned on it, like something out of a 1940s movie. By her side was a small nylon suitcase. The apartment looked as if no one had lived in it for years. All the furniture was covered with sheets. There were no clocks on the walls, no knickknacks, no utensils on the counters. In the corner was a cardboard box filled with photos and glassware. "Would you carry my bag to the car for me?" she asked. I took the suitcase to the cab, then returned to assist the woman. She took my arm, walked slowly to the curb. She kept thanking me over and over for my kindness. "It's nothing," I told her. "I just try to treat my passengers the way I want my own mom to be treated." "Oh my," she said over and over, "you're such a good boy. You're such a good boy." When we got in the cab, she gave me an address, then asked, "Could you drive through downtown?" "Oh, it's not the shortest way," I answered quickly. "Oh, I don't mind," she said. "I'm in no hurry. I'm on my way to hospice." I looked in the rearview mirror. Her eyes were glistening. "I don't have any family left," she continued. "Doctor says I don't have very long." I quietly reached over and shut off the meter. "What route do you want me to take?" For the next 2 hours, we drove through the city. She showed me the building where she had once worked as an elevator operator. We drove through the neighborhood where she and her husband had lived when they were newlyweds. She had me pull up in front of a furniture warehouse that had once been a ballroom where she had gone dancing as a little girl. Sometimes she'd ask me to slow in front of a particular building or corner and would just sit there staring into the darkness, saying nothing. As the first hint of sun was creasing the horizon, she suddenly said, "Okay, I'm tired. Let's go now." We drove in silence to the address that she had given me. It was a low building, like a small convalescent home with a driveway that passed under a portico. 2 orderlies came out to the cab, and as soon as we pulled in, they were solicitous and intent, watching her every move. They must have been expecting her. I opened the trunk and took the small suitcase to the door. The woman was already seated in a wheelchair. "How much do I owe you?" she asked, reaching into her purse. "Oh, nothing," I said. "Oh, you have to make a living," she answered. "There are other customers," I responded. Without thinking, I bent and gave her a big hug. She held on to me tightly. "You give an old woman a little moment of joy," she said. "Thank you." I squeezed her hand, then walked into the dim morning light behind me. A door shut. It was the sound of the closing of a life. I didn't pick up any more passengers that shift. I drove aimlessly, just lost in thought. For the rest of that day, I could hardly talk. What if that woman had gotten an angry driver, or one who was impatient to end his shift? What if I had refused to take the run, or had just honked once and then driven away? On quick review, I don't think that I have ever done anything more important in my whole life. You see, he explains, we are conditioned to think that our lives revolve around grand moments. But great moments often catch us unaware, beautifully wrapped in what others may consider to be a small one. But you see, really, the truly great moments in life happen in between steps. Whenever we treat people like Jesus would have treated them.